Hello. I wanted to make a short rejoinder to my interview with my friends on the Longhouse podcast. We had touched on a subject that I wanted to elaborate on just a little bit more. I recall that my friend, the Walrus Man, was talking about how the policy of the federal government towards Southerners and particularly towards Southern monuments, Civil War monuments, seemed strange to him. He said it seemed to him that the federal government should have been consistent in its opposition to Confederate monuments in the South. And I said that in contrast to his expectation, the federal government was actually rather magnanimous. I believe that this needs further elucidation, more clarification. There were a couple of different regimes. There were a couple of different approaches to this question of how were Southerners to be permitted to think of themselves, speak of themselves, and commemorate their own people, their own generation, their own ancestors. Initially, there was a blanket prohibition of memorializing the Confederate dead. Confederates were they were stripped of their adornments. There are these stories of these penniless Confederate officers returning home immediately after their surrender, immediately after the end of the war, to be stripped of their epaulets and their uniform buttons by imperious Northern soldiers. That's a rather extreme and insulting example of what I'm talking about. But there are other stories about efforts to memorialize Southern heroes, towns wanting to set up monuments to the Southern war dead and being prevented from doing so by the local authorities. Of course, immediately after the end of the war, the whole of the South was under martial law and was occupied by the Union Army until 1876, or at least most of the South was occupied until 1876. An exception was Virginia. Virginia was reconstructed first, you might say. It's kind of a special case. The troops were withdrawn from Virginia before they were withdrawn from the rest of the South, and civil government was returned to the state. But initially, during Reconstruction, it was almost impossible to do that, and also the people of the South were occupied in surviving. With the widespread devastation, both in human resources and in property, that was their priority. They had much more important things going on. The very first monument to commemorate the Confederate dead, as opposed to the Union dead, which did get a lot of commemoration immediately, there was a town in West Virginia, the town of Romney, West Virginia, that had just previously been part of the state of Virginia, and a lot of their menfolk had gone off to war to fight on behalf of the seceded state of Virginia. And then West Virginia seceded from Virginia in the midst of the Civil War. It's a very complex story. Nevertheless, the town of Romney, West Virginia, succeeded in setting up a Confederate monument to commemorate their townsfolk who had died in the war. And that was the very first monument to Confederate soldiers. It was in what was then a Union state, state whose government supported the Union cause. If you take the story of West Virginia just at face value, That's why West Virginia is different than Virginia. That's how it came to be. They supported the Unionist cause in the war. But that's where the very first Confederate monument was set up. And that's something like a loophole in this story. The first Confederate monument was set up in a northern state because there weren't the same strictures in a northern state. But anyway, the first regime of commemoration was illegal. There was no legal commemoration of the Confederate dead. Now, as Reconstruction wound down and finally the troops were removed from the South and civil rights were restored to white Southerners who had supported the Confederate States, who had fought in the Confederate States, when that regime came to an end, the laws changed with it. Once again, ex-Confederates or Confederate sympathizers were in charge of Southern political institutions, and commemoration of the dead became legal when white Southerners were once again in charge of their own institutions. I say white Southerners because, of course, there is this very important block of white Northerners who did come into the South. They were frequently disparaged and called carpetbaggers. The Reconstruction Southern governments are frequently referred to as the carpetbag regimes in the history. They're called carpetbaggers because these people came from the North, putting all their possessions in a overnight bag, all right, something that's very portable, a cheap bag that back in the day was made out of old carpets. That's why they're called carpetbaggers. The idea is that they travel down quickly to take advantage of a situation. And because they were Union men from the North, many of them veterans of the war, they had civil rights in the South. They could vote, they could run for office. And they came down into areas where they were some of the only people left with capital, and they were some of the only people who could run for office, some of the only white people, some of the only educated people, some of the only some of the only people that knew how to talk, knew how to get up in front of people and campaign. So they found themselves very successful entrepreneurs, able to buy large plantations at tax sales for almost nothing because nobody had any money in the community. And also they found themselves very successful in politics. Not surprisingly, white Southerners resented them very much for this, but they also get a bad rap that's rather unfair. They were some of the only people with money, which meant they were indispensable to the economy in the communities where they settled. And without a doubt, a large number of people would have suffered from famine or even starvation had not these carpetbaggers come down and injected their entrepreneurial spirit into the economy. So I give them that. But that's not to say that their administrations were not the most corrupt that perhaps have ever existed in American history. But all that aside, the end of the carpetbag regimes meant that Southerners came back into charge in these communities. North and South then, well, the Northerners extended to the South then a new sort of understanding, a new sort of arrangement, a new sort of narrative of American history that was very conciliatory. I would describe it as magnanimous from a Northern perspective. The idea that Southerners were merely misguided. There was a popular idea in the Northern historians of the period that Southern politics during this time of secession and war had been dominated by extreme radicals who did not actually reflect the will of their populace. Basically, that Southern state governments had been commandeered by terrorists, and that the Southerners themselves shouldn't be held liable for that. They should not be disparaged for that, um, especially considering their valiant record in the war. So much was made of the Southern generalship, their competence, their heroism, their self-sacrifice, their victories even. All of these were taken by Northern commemorators as proof of Anglo-American competency, Anglo-American statesmanship even. Um, they said, oh, the accomplishments of Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee are a tribute to all Americans. Now, I describe this as like a Euro-Americanism, because even at this point in history, the North is beginning to reckon that they have a huge influx of new blood, Italians, Irishmen, um, lots of other distinctive groups from Europe, and they are assimilating them to some degree, but they're also recognizing, oh well, this is a broader experience. This is a more eclectic ethnic grouping than we had had before. Meanwhile, the South remains very Anglo-American. There are some special strains from elsewhere in Europe, mostly Irish, in the South, but they remain more Anglo-American than the North. Now, I would like to contrast this new narrative that I call magnanimous with the older American federalism that the South well represented. And I say that this is a tradition in American politics that characterizes antebellum American political conflicts. So this is referred to by historians of the period as the Jeffersonian American tradition. These days, it is disparaged as the states' rights school of American thought. It's disparaged because it is linked unfairly and unhistorically exclusively to the institution of slavery and attempts to preserve it. Now, no question about it, Southerners did link this school to their concerns about preserving the institution of slavery, and I'm not denying that. What I'm saying is that this was a broader American tradition that was rooted in an interpretation of the Constitution and indeed the formation of the federal union itself. The basic matter of the issue is this: did the states that formed the Union have any existence as independent states? Did they, in fact, possess sovereignty by virtue of their victory in the War for Independence? Could they determine their political fate based on that victory and the Treaty of Paris that followed it? Now, the simple answer to this question would be yes. Emphatically yes. The king in the Treaty of Paris, King George III, treated with the 13 American states as sovereign entities. He listed them all separately. We can all go back to the Declaration of Independence itself, which also claims that these states are independent entities, and it uses the plural when it describes them, that they're not declaring their collective unified independence, but their separate independence as political sovereign entities. There are 13 different republics. Now, this is also implicit in the Articles of Confederation, the first constitution of this new union. Also, if we look at the ratification of the Constitution itself, all 13 states ratify the Constitution on their own. They have not ceded their individual authorities to some central body. And the states, after ratifying the Constitution, still retained ideas that they had prerogative to act on their own. This extended out to things like Supreme Court decisions, which were controversial even back before the Civil War. We have examples of the state of Maryland on one occasion outlawing the Bank of the United States and seizing the assets of the Bank of the United States. This results in a Supreme Court case. That's McCulloch versus Maryland. But it didn't stop other states like Ohio, for instance, from seizing the assets of the Bank of the United States and defying the Supreme Court ruling. Now, the state of Ohio did that in that controversial instance because the state of Ohio claimed that it was a sovereign entity. Now, this is important because we see Ohio is not one of the 13 original states. Yet they inherited an older interpretation of the American Union. Now, later on, we see Southerners saying that the institution of slavery is something that the Southern states, the individual Southern states, should use their authority to expand. Some Southern politicians argued that the individual Southern states could reopen the slave trade, for example. That's the international slave trade. That was not done, but that was a voice in Southern politics in the 1850s. But the whole states' rights school has that association. But we see the states' rights school in northern states that overrules the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision. So we see Wisconsin and Massachusetts, for instance, authorizing the arrest of federal marshals who attempt to apprehend escaped slaves in the jurisdiction of those states. Now, this was mostly just a show, a example of the predominant sentiments in those states about the policing of escaped slaves that were found in the borders of those states. Something, by the way, the original Philadelphia Constitution provided for. That's a very old provision. It wasn't something brand new. What had happened was there had been a compromise in Congress, and there was supposed to be increased policing for escaped slaves in northern states. But those states, on the grounds that they were sovereign entities in a federal union, opted to ignore federal law on the grounds that they had the ultimate decision-making ability. So this is not just a Southern tradition. This is something that northern states also recognized. Now, the victory of the Union in the Civil War brought about the end of that interpretation. Obviously, that is not how power would work in the American Union. And arguments to that effect disappear for a time. Now, arguments about states' rights reappear in the mid-20th century. I'm not here to discuss that. Perhaps that was just a quixotic fancy at the end of the day. I'm inclined to think that it was. It's done. I don't see states asserting such prerogatives, nor do I see those kinds of attitudes in America today. But back to my point. Northerners co-opt Southern heroes in this period right after Reconstruction. One very famous example of this is Charles Francis Adams, who is a member of the very famous Adams family, a descendant of John Adams and John Quincy Adams, Charles Francis Adams Jr. was the CEO of the Union Pacific Railroad for a time and also an amateur historian. Unlike his brothers, he made his history writing a side gig, if you will. Henry Adams is a full-time major American historian. But Charles Francis Adams goes and gives commemorative speeches praising the legacy of Robert E. Lee. And his main point is if I had been in the shoes of Robert E. Lee, I would have done the same thing he did. And he is making this appeal to other Northern gentlemen, and he is winning them over to the noble legacy of Robert E. Lee. Charles Francis Adams Jr. commemorates Lee as an American hero, a hero for all Americans, presumably. Let's go ahead and read in there, all white Americans, I do not doubt. And Lee really becomes a minor American hero, so much so that there was a statue of Robert E. Lee in the United States Capitol building until a year or two ago when it was removed, not surprisingly. But it was there so recently that I saw it there only a few years ago. When I made my one visit to the Capitol, I did see it there. It was still there. So Lee becomes an American hero commemorated in postage stamps, commemorative medallions made by the United States Mint, and even federally sponsored memorial projects. One of the most famous is Stone Mountain in Georgia, just outside of Atlanta, which contains a huge monumental engraving of President Jefferson Davis with Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson all mounted on horseback. So it's this huge bas-relief in the side of Stone Mountain. That was funded in part by commemorative coins from the Philadelphia Mint that were sold as a fundraising project. Commemorative coins which contained an engraving of these Confederate heroes. That was all sponsored by the federal government. The federal government helped make that monument, as improbable as that might be. But that is because there is a narrative here that, oh, well, these men were heroic but misguided. All right. Now that's opposed to the Southern narrative, which is, we're glad we fought, we only wish we'd won. All right. There's also an interesting connection here, just as an aside. There were Victorian Brits who also loved these Southern heroes, not just because they are so very tied to the English world. They are descended from English settlers in the South, predominantly. The British are willing to lump the Scotch-Irish in there with them. And Stonewall Jackson gets funding from the British Empire. There is a British aristocrat, I forget his name, he's a lord of some sort. He fundraised and spearheads a monument association back in Great Britain to build a monument for Stonewall Jackson in Lexington, Virginia. And you can still see that monument today. It now serves as Jackson's headstone. It's a large bronze monument that stands in the middle of the graveyard that Jackson's buried in. So they actually moved Jackson's body from his original grave site into this monumental area in the middle of the graveyard. And that British lord says Stonewall Jackson represents what is best in all Anglos. And that's also very interesting. Okay, so there's this ethnic connection here, that there's this noble heritage. And the Britisher says that these Southern heroes are an inspiration to English people. And it's because of a shared heritage, a shared tradition. That's what he refers to. We see the reconciliation of the sections come to a kind of fruition with the Spanish-American War in 1898. And something that historians like to remark on, it's kind of an ironic event in American history. We see former Confederate generals who were younger generals during the Civil War serve again in the Union Blue for the cause of American empire. So they march into battle against the Spanish Empire at this point to conquer Cuba and the Philippines. There are several areas that are annexed to the United States, become American territories. The Philippines being the most important area, but this is where the United States gets Puerto Rico, for instance, and also the little island of Guam. And as collateral conquest, the there is a coup in Hawaii, and the Marines land, and the Kingdom of Hawaii, even though it has nothing to do with Spain, gets annexed to become a United States territory and later on an American state. Okay, so there's this time of expansion. And in the Spanish-American War, there are a couple of former Confederate generals who take up arms, this time in service of Washington, D.C. And we see in that a kind of reconciliation. We see a lot of Civil War veterans in arms together. Now, these are going to be some of the oldest soldiers that do take part, but this is something that's done, and it's commemorated in the press of the time. Most amusingly, one of these former Confederate generals, Joseph Wheeler, I believe he was from Alabama, if I'm not mistaken. Joseph Wheeler leads men into battle. He actually takes the field and is involved with combat. And he is heard to say in battle, "We've got the Yankees on the run again. Let's get 'em, boys." And he is obviously traveled to a battlefield back in his memories, thinking of his former passion in battle against the Yankees. So this is an amusing moment in the Spanish-American War. But it also shows there's a kind of reconciliation between the sections. So there's a new idea of American unity. But that idea, or that regime, if you'd like to call this new way of thinking, this new myth, if you'd like to associate that with a way of governing or a justification for the American government, I think that's a useful connection to make in our imaginations. That regime comes to an end, I would say, with the new civil rights regime in the 1950s and 60s, which is spearheaded by elites, particularly Earl Warren's Supreme Court and their decision of Brown versus the Board of Education. That is a very important decision in the 1950s that is the impetus for a lot of the civil rights legislation that follows in Congress. But we see the Supreme Court acted first. And also, very tellingly, the Supreme Court acted unanimously. So we see that there is consensus among the American elites on that question of the end of segregation in America. But there is this time where there is a European American unity. Americans see themselves as European American or Anglo American, and they look back at a common legacy. Now, I would like to suggest this is a more exclusively Northern narrative, but I think it was a constructive narrative given the circumstances. Southerners who embraced this idea of American history found places in the new regime. The most important Southerner who did embrace this narrative is Woodrow Wilson, who is a good figure to associate with this way of thinking, this narrative of American history. And he is also, for better or for worse, one of our more creative American presidents, an innovative and thoughtful American president, if not to say ideological American president. Our last president from Virginia, a very important man, whatever we might think of his legacy. I particularly do not like Woodrow Wilson, but I do not deny his legacy or his importance or his creativity. I just I don't like what he thought about these things. Nevertheless, Woodrow Wilson shows us one way of understanding ethnic America, which for Woodrow Wilson would be exclusively white America. He was not commenting on the mixed ethnic legacy of America and thinking about Black Americans. He's thinking about Black Americans in a completely different category in his mind. And we can prove that. I'm not going into that right now, but that's very well known about him now, which is one of the reasons why he has been canceled. But Woodrow Wilson, in a very famous speech he gave in Pueblo, Colorado, it was the last speech of his political career, coincidentally. Woodrow Wilson contended against the idea that we would have what he called hyphenated Americans. That is, Americans that think of themselves as Irish American or Hungarian American or whatever they might be. He said that that was bad, that we should all think of ourselves as Americans without any qualification. Now, once again, he was not thinking about that in relation to Black Americans. And we can read his rhetoric and we can read our own ideas into that and say, oh, well, he was a colorblind guy. He didn't believe in seeing color. No, that's not how he thought. And if we read him in the context of his other writings, we can see that he certainly did not think that there was no difference between white and black, for instance. The man was a segregationist, and he countenanced segregation in the federal government. He actually advanced segregation between white and black in the federal government. What Woodrow Wilson was talking about was no distinctions among European Americans. We might say he is a white identity sort of guy. All right. Now, when I'm saying that I've got criticisms of Woodrow Wilson, I'm not trying to get into that here. All right. But he said that people that used a hyphen to describe their heritage as, we can say implicitly, as white Americans were like, they were as if they had a dagger ready to plunge into the vitals of the Republic. All right, so Woodrow Wilson is saying that among white Americans, there should be no distinction or ethnic conflict. All right, so we can kind of read that into what he's saying, and perhaps I'm going out on a limb with that, but I just wanted to illustrate that as part of that narrative of American history. And I'm saying that narrative of American history is dead by the end of World War II. I'd say by the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations, that vision of American identity is dying. Coincidentally, just as another connection to make, you may have seen some of these pictures, photographs of John F. Kennedy being received by Democratic committees, Democratic conferences in the South while he's campaigning for president, and pictured with large Confederate battle flags. John F. Kennedy was a Democrat, and he understood the legacy of the Democratic Party in the United States. And in the South, that was a party that was certainly deeply connected with the states' rights tradition, the Confederate tradition, right? That's all part and parcel, even at that late date. Another example of how late this narrative of honor for ex-Confederates lasts in the United States and even in the regime itself, deep in the regime, is General Eisenhower, who kept a bust of Robert E. Lee in the Oval Office. And when asked about it by critics, because there were critics among the elites even then, and they were outspoken, Eisenhower said Lee was everything an honorable American could ever hope to be, and did not apologize for his respect for Lee, his commemoration of Lee in his selections for the Oval Office itself, and Eisenhower being a war buff, a history buff, even retired to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. That's where he spent the rest of his life after his term in office. So, interesting period of American history, a narrative, a story that's told about American history relating to the honor of the South. Long digression. I hope that you enjoyed it and got something out of it.